study for the test, right? There's a fair amount of harder algebra questions, for instance. So the SAT structure is always the same structure. So one of the things that we always do that's really important is getting students familiar with the test, right? The test is this intimidating thing, but it's always the same. It's always structured the same. So the first section is always a reading test, 65 minutes. Second section is always writing a language test. And then third is the math test with no calculator. And fourth is the math test with the calculator. And then finally the optional fifth essay, which is 50 minutes. So all told, you'd be, if you were taking the test with the essay, it'd be 3 hours and 50 minutes. Without the essay, it's 3 hours. So it's a pretty long test. One other thing that's important is there's no penalty for guessing anymore. So in the old SAT, it used to be you get a quarter point off if you missed a question. That's no longer the case. That is exactly the same as the ACT. So if you run out of time, just fill in a bunch of C's, and like you'll probably get some of them right, where that used to not be a strategy. And there's 4 multiple choices per question, and that's consistent across the board. That is one thing that differs from the ACT. There are some 5 multiple choice questions in the ACT. Cool. So any questions on the SAT and what's changed and anything else there? Yeah.
I just asked, I'm not sure, but the essay, does that, the 50 minutes, does that actually include reading an article and then?
That's the whole time.
Evaluative?
That's the whole time, yeah.
And that's the new part, right? The new SAT?
That's right, yeah.
Because the old one was.
Yeah, it was different. It was longer. For that. Any other questions about the SAT? Cool. So now we'll talk a little bit about the ACT, which is probably a test you may or may not be more familiar or less familiar with. So the ACT has 4 sections: English, math, reading, science, and then the writing section at the end, which is optional. The composite score is the average across those 4 sections, and it's out of 36 total points. So you get a total out of 36. Again, this has, you'll see some similarities here, not unintentional by the SAT. The ACT has these subscores. It then has this cross-sectional piece as well, which is this English language and arts, and then the STEM piece as well. So that's how the ACT is structured. And often people ask, like, interesting anecdote is one of the reasons that the ACT and SAT look a lot alike now is the person who originally came up with this structure for the ACT and the sub-scores and the cross-sectional scores and pitched that at the ACT and developed that content, now works for the SAT. He went over there about 2.5 years ago and essentially took a lot of that knowledge from the ACT and injected into the SAT. So that's why you see a lot of these things look very similar. It's literally the same person doing it.
It's like the Verizon guy, right, that you switched to?
Yeah, he's the Sprint guy.
Sprint now, right?
Exactly
Yeah,
the same, yeah. Although I don't know how much he actually affects the network.
No. He's not programming it. No.
That's right. So any question on ACT scoring? So for some parents it's a little unusual. It's not what they're used to. They're used to the 1600. So there's concordance tables, by the way, to compare your SAT score to your ACT score that colleges use. They're published. They're online. So you can say, okay, we'll talk a little bit how to choose between ACT and SAT, but I got a 28 on the ACT. What does that mean on the SAT? Roughly where would I be? Those concordance tables right now, the accuracy is probably not as good as it normally is, again, because they just had this first test and they're still collecting that data, but it'll at least give you a rough guesstimate about where you would be on one test or the other. So the ACT structure, just like the SAT, is the same every time you go in. So first section is English, 45 minutes. Second section is math. One of the big differences on the SAT and the ACT, which I just mentioned, is the ACT math allows you to use a calculator the whole time. The thing it doesn't do that you get on the SAT is you don't get any formulas. So you need to know all your formulas going into that test. You need to have them all memorized. They tend to be less complex than the SAT, but the SAT gives you a pretty broad swath of formulas going into that test. So for students who struggle with memorization, that's one way to dictate which ACT to take. The third section is reading, and then the fourth is science, and then the optional fifth essay. So you see the time is roughly the same. It's 3 hours and 35 minutes with the essay, which is 15 minutes shorter than the SAT, or 2 hours and 55 minutes without the essay, which is 5 minutes shorter. So pretty close. Again, there's no penalty for wrong answer choices, which there never has been on the ACT, but that's not the same as the SAT. And there are 4 to 5 multiple choice questions, multiple choices per question. The other thing I should mention on the math section is it's all multiple choice, where the SAT now has a handful of fill in the blank questions. The ACT does not. It's all multiple choice. You don't have to come up with the answer.
On the calculator, was a calculator allowed on the old SAT?
It was. So that's a big change. None of the arithmetic on the new SAT is particularly challenging, but you do have to, like, a lot of students are pretty dependent on their calculators, so that part can be a little off-putting for them. So any questions about ACT structure? Yeah.
Well, this isn't really about structure, but, and maybe you're gonna talk about this later.
Yeah.
I mean, it seems like one glaring distinction is the science section.
Yeah.
But I don't know, and I'm sorry, I'm so old. We I took the SAT so many years ago and we never had a science section. But when you said originally that you don't need any substantive knowledge of science.
Yeah.
So I don't understand, so I understand interpreting data and graphs and so
Yep.
forth. But how is that science as opposed to math, because you do the same math? So what does that mean?
Yeah, what does science mean in it? So there are science topics, right? That's all it means. So the science vocabulary and the wording will be very science heavy, and it'll ask you things like, chemical reaction goes at this speed, and then it'll give you a bunch of data about that, and then ask you some questions. So it's a science topic with science data and graphs being added to it. The funny thing, well, not the funny thing, but one of the things that SAT did in the math section was try to put interpretations of word problems that look very similar to the thing that you're talking about, right? Where now they have context and they have some, social studies, social science problems, and they have some actual science problems in there, and those look roughly similar to what they do on the ACT, except for their math-based questions. The thing about the ACT science is they're not really math-based questions. It's really a reading comprehension section. So you often see if I have a student comes to me and actually I have a student right now in this case, they got a 33 on their reading and they had a 25 on their science. I know there's a massive delta to be made up because they have very good reading comprehension skills, and they're just getting intimidated either by interpreting what are relatively simple graphs and tables, or the wording and the content on that, which is not all that difficult once they realize that the words are just jargon and they're not all that important for the questions. They don't need to know the definitions of those words, but everything that they need to know is explained on the test.
So is that the essence of it? There's not science content and knowledge, it's just familiarity, seeing science words and concepts.
And interpretation of graphs and tables. That's what I think the thing
So
is
pattern
most like
pattern
science
recognition,
class.
having
Yeah.
spent. So it's really that more than like knowledge of biology or physics.
There's
or,
no knowledge of biology or physics or chemistry
Right.
or anything that you need to have going into the ACT. And that's why generally the reading comprehension and science score track pretty closely together. Cool. Any other questions? So one question we get all the time, especially in this time of year as people are going in their junior years thinking about taking the test in the spring, and even once they've taken a test, is which test should I take? So I think it's important to be pretty data driven in how you think about this. So first take a diagnostic. So take a diagnostic on the SAT or the ACT. Oftentimes, students in Connecticut will have taken a PSAT or two and know roughly what score they're going to get in the SAT. So then taking an ACT diagnostics, seeing roughly where you score, and comparing those works pretty well to see how you'll do. There's not a lot of SAT versus ACT diagnostics out there yet to determine which one you should take, although those are being developed. If there's a clear winner, then it's obvious. You got 95th percentile in the SAT and you got 30th percentile in the ACT. Well, it's clear which test you should spend your time on, and there's no real question there. The one thing we tell everybody is still monitor your progress. So as you're studying for this test, as you're getting prepared for it, see how you do, how that trajectory goes over time, and make sure you're taking that other diagnostics to see how that goes.
Yeah, because the more, like, you use the outliers to make a point, but more practically it would be something like 68 and 50th.
Right.
And you'd go with the test that you were 68th in, but if a couple weeks into a good rigorous process you're 74th, there's cause to pause and reflect and make sure that continues to be the right.
That's right.
Right.
That's right. And then if you have similar scores, meaning they're within 1% or 2, now you have a real question of like, well, what do I do? So there's a couple things that come up in that case. So it really gets down down to your test taking preferences. And what we mean by that, referring to this a little bit before, is, well, ACT versus SAT. So